Majora's Mask is one of the strangest games I've ever played. Released in the year 2000 as a follow-up to Ocarina of Time, this strange sequel would go on to shape one of the most unique experiences you can find not only within the Zelda franchise, but within the entire gaming industry as a whole. After the release of Ocarina of Time, the director of the Zelda series, Eiji Aonuma, was hit with one of the most difficult tasks by Shigeru Miyamoto. That task being to construct an entirely new Zelda game in less than 2 years. Well, if anything, this experience just goes to show how much of a genius Aonuma really is. Why spend lots of time creating tons of new character models when you can just pull them straight from the previous game? So what did he do? Him and his team built a Zelda game which focused heavily on brand new mechanics rather than new characters, aiming to ensure that the sequel to the most critically acclaimed game of all time would live up to its legacy and status as a game in the Legend of Zelda franchise. Well, it's no surprise that Aonuma reached his seemingly impossible goal, as he not only created a great game, but a memorable experience that the fans still talk about over 20 years after its release. This is my retrospective of The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. So after entering a parallel universe to Hyrule, we're introduced to the Happy Mask Salesman, who you might remember from Ocarina of Time. This is just one of the many examples which show how brilliant it was to reuse old character models. Things you came to expect from these people in the previous game will be completely turned sideways, as we see here with the Mask Salesman. He plays a much greater role this time, but he mainly keeps his identity a secret. This game does a great job at completely obscuring the origins of both the Mask Salesman and Majora, which is genius. Sometimes, mysteries are best left unanswered, and when done correctly, this can create a powerful tool in creating speculation among the fanbase over the backstory of a certain character, such as what we see here. Anyways, after interacting with the Happy Mask Salesman, Link emerges into a seemingly normal town, but there's just one problem. This giant moon is literally going to bury this place into the ground in 3 days, and it's up to Link to eliminate not only the moon, but Majora as well. Now, one thing that's unlike any other Zelda game is you don't really start the game as Link. Almost immediately, Skull Kid turns him into a Deku Scrub, which turns the first part of the game into a mission to revert Link back to his original form. This could actually cause great confusion to players if they have never played a Zelda game before, which is why it is highly recommended that you do not play this as your first Zelda experience. Starting the game out as a Deku is basically the developers telling you to play Ocarina of Time first. Otherwise, it is very likely that someone could get stuck in this first part, never knowing what to do. And this entire game is just weird as a whole. Don't get me wrong, but literally nothing done in the beginning resembles the start to any other Zelda game at all. One of the first tasks that must be tackled is playing hide and seek with the Bomber Kids, but they don't accept Link since he's a Deku Scrub, which makes this whole thing even more difficult. Imagine it would be incredibly sad to be Link, considering he just saved Hyrule from destruction, only to end up in an alternate world where nobody knows who he is, or any of the accomplishments he's made. Link went from being the hero of time to a scrub who literally gets undermined by a bunch of little kids. One thing I love about this game is that it was not at all scared of shying away from the typical Zelda formula. This is one of the few games where there is no Ganon, no Master Sword, and no Princess Zelda, aside from one very brief cutscene. It just shapes an even more uncomfortable playthrough knowing none of these familiar tropes return. So after you find all the Bomber Kids, Link is granted access to the Astral Observatory, which is incredibly surreal and beautiful, but also highlights one of Majora's Mask's most prominent themes, that being an underlying feeling of sadness mixed with hope. The song played here just perfectly captures this game's theme, and that's one of the main reasons I love the Astral Observatory so much. After looking into the telescope, you're given the chance to take one of the moon's tears, which is required for progression. You actually have to bring this to a Deku Scrub placed right in the center of town, so Deku Link is granted access to the flower which launches him up to the stairs leading to Skull Kid. You then have to shoot a bubble at him to cause the ocarina to fall out of his hands, which is when Link can pick it up, and once you learn the Song of Time from a memory of Princess Zelda, after playing it with the Deku instrument, the game resets completely, essentially starting anew. Now's the time to go back to the Happy Mask Salesman and learn the Song of Healing, so that way Link can turn back to his Hylian form. You also get to keep the Deku Mask, which allows Link to transform back into the Deku Scrub at a moment's notice. This is when the game truly starts, and right out of the gate, there's a wealth of optional tasks that can be completed before even tackling the main story. This is another way Majora's Mask separates itself from its predecessor. Rather than focusing heavily on dungeons and locations like before, the side quests are now where most of the action is discovered. I'd say if you don't plan on doing any side activity in the game, there really is no point in playing it. So much will be missed out on if only going for the main quests. Learning about Termina's character and each of their quirks is part of what makes the game so special. The side quests carry the game, and without them, Majora's Mask would absolutely not be remembered as fondly as it still is today. And that's not to say the main game is bad by any means, because they're just objectively wrong. Sure, I have my issues with the game, which I'll go over in time, but for now let's just focus on gameplay and structure of the world. Right out of the gate, Termina Field is a great improvement over Hyrule Field. While Hyrule Field was revolutionary for its time, at times it would feel extremely barren and exhausting to traverse. That is not the case with Termina's counterpart, however, as each main area of the game is sectioned into 4 different sections of the map, essentially forming one big circle with Clocktown sitting right in the middle, sort of emulating a hub for the players to enter and exit in order to reach these different places. The first place Link explores is the Southern Swamp in Woodfall, which houses the game's first dungeon. Here you'll meet the witches from Ocarina of Time, except this time they aren't evil like many players probably expected the first time they played this game. No, in fact they are quite friendly this time around, even offering Link a free boat ride and giving him a bottle, which is obviously one of the most valuable items in the pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda games. Anyways, each region of Termina covers one mask, which essentially replaces the items seen in Ocarina of Time. The Southern Swamp heavily focuses on the Deku Mask, which means most of the traversal and puzzle require this mask for progression. Once you arrive in the Deku Palace, the king describes how he's going to boil this monkey to death for no reason other than false accusation. So it's Link's job to navigate the place in order to find this monkey and learn the song from him, which is obviously going to be very important. His song is called the Sonata of Awakening, which is one of my personal favorites in the game. Koji Kondo once again outdid himself with the soundtrack, as it's just another reason Majora's Mask shot into stardom. The soundtrack absolutely completes the experience and complements each area and dungeon perfectly. This game really wouldn't be the same without Koji Kondo's brilliant understanding of video game music and atmosphere as a whole, as many players even consider the soundtrack to be better than Ocarina of Time's. But back to the game itself, tackling the first dungeon of the game is next task handed out to Link. This is a Woodfall Temple, and when comparing this temple to Ocarina of Time's first dungeon, the Great Deku Tree, the spike in difficulty is made abundantly clear. Now this may come down to the fact that Majora's Mask only has 4 dungeons, as compared to 7 previously, but not only that, I think the developers really expected the players to understand the mechanics of the game this time around, because rather than teaching them to play through a dungeon, we are already expected to know how these work because of Ocarina of Time. Now something that was a little disappointing to me was the items given out in these dungeons. In Woodfall Temple, after fighting the mini-boss, you get the bow, which is fine, but every single dungeon after this just gives you a new type of arrow to use with the bow, such as fire, ice, and light arrows. Though it may be a little bland compared to what we got previously, the masks act as this game's main source of items, so I really can't complain. The boss of Woodfall Temple is Odalwa, and this is one of the most controversial changes within the original Majora's Mask and its 3D remake. In the original, bosses could be defeated by wailing on them with whatever items you had available at the time until they were defeated. However, this time every boss has this eyewall weak point that I personally hate. It dumbs these battles down so much because you know that the only way to beat any of them is by exposing their eyes, and slashing the eye with your sword or shooting them with your arrow. For example, Odalwa used to be an exciting sword fight, but now all you do is use Deku Link to fly over him and drop a Deku Nut on his head. which then exposes a weak point. It just really isn't fun, and I have no idea why Nintendo changed this. But after beating the boss, Link is taken to this very surreal area, which makes heavy use of motion blur to make it feel even more dreamlike. This is where we discover that these giants are the guardians of Termina, and to free them, each temple needs to be completed. Finishing a dungeon usually shows a quick cinematic of that current area being restored to its former, glorious self. However, this always feels completely pointless, as the second Link plays the Song of Time, everything will be undone, and everyone will be suffering again. This further drives home the feeling of dread, which is clearly this game's main theme, and I love it all the more for it. So now it's time to go after Snowhead, which is a huge step up in difficulty from Woodfall. Everything is so obscure here, there really is no hand holding at all in this game. Here you get the Lens of Truth, which is mainly used to follow Romani, who was once a proud Goron warrior before he was killed by another Goron placed under Majora's curse. Following this guy all the way up to his grave and playing the Song of Healing for him rewards Link with the Goron's mask, which is definitely the best mask in the game, especially in the remake. Wearing this mask fools everyone into thinking Link is the dead Goron warrior, and that he's suddenly returned out of nowhere to help them, when in reality, it's just Link. This is actually pretty depressing when you think about it. I mean, imagine if in real life, some animal or something was wearing the mask of a dead human, which makes him appear as that deceased person, fooling them all into thinking it's actually a human. Yeah, it's both horrifying and sad at the same time. But that's besides the point. Wearing the Goron mask can fool this old man into thinking you're Romani, and after hearing that his son is in need of him, he teaches Link the first half of the lullaby, which is used to put the baby to sleep, as well as open up the entry to the next dungeon. This baby teaches you the other half of the Goron's lullaby, which finally means you have all the tools required for the next dungeon, Snowhead Temple. This place is terrifying. It contains a huge central room with rising pillars which must be knocked down at very specific times, otherwise the whole thing gets messed up. In my opinion, this is the most difficult dungeon in the game, as it definitely took me the longest. However, one thing I really liked about the temples in Majora's Mask is how smart they require the player to be in order to complete them. You can't just run around and expect to finish these. Each one is intricately designed with a central room and main gimmick that designed to be mastered, otherwise there's literally no hope in finishing any of these. The mini-boss in Snowhead is Wizrobe, which really started to get on my nerves by the end of the game. He's definitely a prime example of how rushed Majora's Mask was, considering you fight him numerous times with very minute changes. And on top of that, it's just not a fun fight. All you do is wait for him to teleport around, then shoot an arrow. And in Snowhead Temple, you're rewarded with the fire arrows for defeating him, which just opens up the area even more. There really is an overwhelming amount of things to do here, including collecting all the stray fairies, which grants you amazing abilities. So while it may be hard to find all these, it's well worth the payoff, and it offers a great risk-reward system to the player throughout each new temple. The boss fight here is probably the best one, mainly because you don't really need to focus on the eyeball weak spot that much. Sure, the eye still needs to be destroyed, but racing around as a Goron trying to keep up with this thing is extremely exhilarating, and it feels great to actually defeat it. Overall, a great dungeon with a top-notch boss fight to cap it all off. Now it's around this point in the game where you can finally upgrade from the dinky Kokiri sword to the Razor sword, but sadly, this weapon completely breaks in 100 hits, so even though it looks amazing, you gotta upgrade it again with gold dust to get the Gilded Sword, which sort of functions as this game's Master Sword. It's more powerful and it never breaks, also doing double the damage as the Kokiri sword. So now that you've unlocked the ability to become a Goron, you can reset time and go buy a powder keg, which allows access to Romani Ranch on the first day, you know, before Romani gets lobotomized. Tons of events occur here. For starters, Link finally reunites with Epona, so now you have the option to call on her whenever you need. Unfortunately, her use is very diminished in this game due to the Goron's mask existence. Whenever Link transforms into a Goron, he can travel way faster than with Epona. It's also less of a hassle to use Goron Mask because you won't have to play the ocarina. After this, Romani describes these ghosts appearing as aliens known simply as them. This is incredibly intriguing and lends even more mystery to this game. Once you complete some target practice on these balloons, Romani will tell you how at 2 AM, the aliens will come and she needs his help fending them off. This is by far the most random and weird side quest in the game, as you're literally defending a farm from ghost aliens, but it's still a lot of fun and can be pretty tense due to the main directions these aliens spawn in from. But if you're able to fight them off for long enough time, the ranch will be saved and Romani will reward you with a bottle. This opens up another side quest where you take a stroll into town with your older sister Termina, but there's construction so you need to take a detour, which means keeping 2 of these from breaking the milk on the back of the wagon. This has a surprisingly heartwarming ending, as Termina gives Link a mask and acknowledges him as an adult. These side quests are what help make Majora's Mask such a special and unique experience. But since that's finished, you can actually make your way over to the third area of the game with Epona, Great Bay. This is where you get the Zora mask after listening to this one sing and drop dead right in front of you. Now in the Nintendo 64 version of the game, this mask was incredibly fun to use. However, in the remake, they made it to where you can't boost without using magic, which just completely ruins the controls and fun that the original game set in place. This usually just ends up in swimming being extremely slow in order to preserve magic, and it just makes everything absurdly boring and frustrating. As mentioned earlier, the masks fulfill the role of the most important item now. The Zora mask even fills up 2 of these items, those being the Iron Boots and the Zora Tunic. Once the Zora mask is obtained, you gotta get the eggs from the Pirate's Fortress, which can be very difficult unless you cheat your way through it by giving this guy some medicine in exchange for a mask that literally turns Link invisible and makes this whole section a complete cakewalk. This is where you find the hookshot, one of the few major items returning from Ocarina of Time. In the Pirate's Fortress, the main objective is to collect 4 of the 7 Zora eggs that lie within fish tanks in certain rooms. And again, this is super easy with the stone mask, so there really isn't much to talk about here. Now you can go after the 3 other eggs which are located in Pinnacle Rock. But first you need to give this creep a picture of the Gerudo Pirates. For some reason. Anyways, this seahorse directs you to Pinnacle Rock, where you must destroy these eels to find the remaining 3 Zora eggs. This finally completes that filler section and gives Link the important dungeon song. This one's pretty cool. I like how all the little fish start dancing around all cute. You can now open up the entrance to Great Bay Temple with this song, and this is a dungeon which most people consider to be the hardest, and I definitely agree that this can be pretty tough, but Snowhead will always give me the most trouble. Great Bay Temple's main gimmick is this giant water wheel which must be manipulated by activating different water switches. This can be quite tough, especially if you aren't careful and you forget which rooms you've been in. This temple also holds a very annoying mini-boss, where you just have to wait and shoot his giant blob thing with an ice arrow. Yeah, one thing this game doesn't do right is the mini-bosses, that's for sure. Most of them are either repeated or just not interesting in their execution. The boss of this dungeon is absolutely terrible, I'm just gonna say it, but I really don't think I'm alone when I say that. Many people seem to hate this boss as well. It's just beyond frustrating, especially in the 3DS version. Oh my lord, this thing sucks. I can't even begin to explain how frustrating this encounter is. It lasts way too long and has 0 redeeming qualities. End of story. Well, after that painful experience, it's time to enter the last area of the game, Ikana Valley. And this whole section lasts a very long time. You first need to learn the Song of Storms so you can play it to this one ghost in order to force the Gibdos into hiding. But then you have to enter this strange music box house, only to find a half-mummified man, and when his daughter sees you trying to kill him, it's actually quite heartbreaking. This is definitely one of the most emotional parts of the game, and it really just goes to show how hopeless everyone in Termina really is. The part after this is one of my biggest problems with the game, however, and that is the abundant amount of filler. Obviously, this game was so rushed, there was bound to be some unnecessary content present, but this just pushes it too far. You have to go on a major fetch quest in order to give each of these Gibdos something very specific, which just ends up being an awful waste of time. They literally could have done anything else but this and it would have been better than what we were left with. This single part right here is literally what makes me not want to replay this game whenever I consider booting up a new save file. Yes, it's really just that bad. At the end of all this, you finally get the Mirror Shield and have to take on another mini dungeon, that being Ikana Castle. This one really isn't that great or interesting. Besides having absolutely incredible music, it also pulls a fast and dirty one on anyone who's never played this game before. You see, right at the end, there's this giant crack in the floor which needs to be blown up with a powder keg, which can only be bought from a specific Goron in Clocktown. So they really expected someone who's never played this game before to actually have a powder keg on them once they reach this point. It's just another example of filler. But anyways, there's a little fight here which can be pretty annoying at times, but basically, you just fight the king's 2 henchmen, and once defeating them, you fight the king himself, which really isn't all too difficult. You just melt him using your mirror shield. But after that, he decides to teach Link the most horrifying song ever, and no, I do not mean the melody itself, it's actually quite nice. But look at what the song creates. This abomination scared the soul out of me the first time I saw it. There's just something about it that really freaks me out and gives me an unpleasant feeling. I used to just get out of this room as fast as I can because I thought it would kill me if I messed around with it for too long. Thankfully that's not true. So after that, you finally get to make your way up to Stone Tower Temple, which can also just be brutal for new players. You need to play the Elegy of Emptiness in very specific orders to move these blocks, but if you fail, you have to restart the whole process. Also, the sheer amount of times needed to play the Elegy of Emptiness is exhausting. I mean, before even reaching the actual dungeon, you'll be burned out with this song and being forced to watch these statues move 100 times. The Stone Tower Temple is often considered to be one of the very best dungeons in the entire series, and I totally agree. It's extremely fun and has tons of branching pathways to take. It's also very daunting and requires lots of attention to complete. It makes use of all 3 transformation masks and really lives up to the expectations of what a final challenge should be. But that's not all. Halfway through the dungeon, you need to shoot a light arrow at this gem in order to literally flip it on its head. So now you have to play through the entire thing upside down. It truly is great and a genius way to expand upon the dungeon, especially for the time it was released. This place is just huge and feels so good to scale and complete. Sadly, I can't say the same for the boss. Yep, this fight against Twin Mold, and it's yet another victim of the remake's terrible change in boss fights. Originally, you fought this thing with a sword, so it really felt epic. It felt like you could just go to town on these things until they were dead. But now you don't have access to your sword, and you don't even get the Giant's Mask until halfway through the fight. And once you get the mask, you have to spend so much time just waiting for the red guy to fly out, all while you frantically push him numerous times just hoping you'll take it down. And once you finally do, you get to do this pretty cool wrestling move against it, but it stops being cool after the 90th time you get to hit this stupid thing. Anyways, now that that's completed, it's on to the final part of the game, which takes place inside the moon. It was very unexpected to suddenly go from chaos into this serene and surreal, sunny environment. This is just one of the many genius ways Majora's Mask plays with your expectations and emotions. Here you'll find these kids running around, which eerily resemble the Happy Mask salesman, at least from their hair, which just brings even more questions to what he is and what his motives actually are. If you interact with one of these moon children, they'll ask you to give them some of your masks, which will bring Link to a sort of mini dungeon. These can be pretty confusing, and if you complete all of them, you're rewarded with the Fierce Deity mask, which can literally kill Majora in a few seconds, so I'm going to talk about the fight proper. To initiate this battle, you need to talk with this creepy kid wearing Majora's Mask for some reason. This fight is way tougher than most other final encounters in the Zelda franchise, mainly due to how chaotic it is. You gotta deal with all the previous main bosses shooting lasers at you, along with Majora itself. And this one phase where he just runs around screaming frantically was so entertaining, and when it started moonwalking, I just lost myself. This whole fight was so hilarious, but difficult at the same time. This game is just so marvelously weird. Well, that's Majora's Mask. I don't think any game will ever quite achieve what this game did. It proved the impossible, that even though a horribly strict time limit was placed upon them, with a talented enough team, something truly special can be created. If you're going to play The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, I recommend going for all side quests and obtaining all the masks because it really just doesn't feel like you're experiencing the whole game when you don't. But if there's one thing you shouldn't do, it's playing this as your first Zelda game. Trust me, it will overwhelm you and could completely turn you off from the game. That would be doing a disservice to not only the game, but yourself. Play Ocarina of Time, then Majora's Mask. You'll be pleasantly surprised at the amount of cohesion these two games share among each other. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to meeting you guys in the next one.